Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Tonight, I'd like to deal with an issue that has been coming back again and again, where some people talk of the army, the Zimbabwe National Army, being the power behind Zanu PF and how our politics is influenced by the army. I think this is a myth. There is absolutely no truth in that. In fact, some of the people who are spreading the myth is they're spreading it for their own political reason to justify their own failures. Um, the Zimbabwe National Army is not as powerful as some people would want us to believe. That is a fact. And in fact, at the time of independence, the Zimbabwe National Army was considered to be probably one of the most disciplined um, armies in Africa. The British, who trained most of our senior officers, and did a good job in that regard, with the exception of Kukurawundi. And Kukurawundi were not trained by the British, as far as I know. And for those who are not aware of it, Kukurawundi was the 5th Brigade that was mostly responsible for the atrocities during the infamous Kukurawundi massacre. That's between 1983 to 1987. Otherwise, the army itself has been a very disciplined army. The problem only came when Zanu PF, Robert Mugabe, was beginning to worry about his hold on power. And he needed the army to back him up, to help him impose the one party dictatorship. And one of the arms of the army that he used there was the 5th Brigade, as I mentioned before, during the Kukurawundi period. But with time, he also enticed the other sections, the rest of the army, plus the police, the CIO, and the prison services, and formed what is generally called um, the joint command operation, um, which included the top brass in those security services. And basically, they were enticed into believing that their position in those services were linked to Zanu PF. And Mugabe, like he did with all the other sectors, including his own cabinet, gave them generous salaries, generous allowances, enticing them to commit themselves to Zanu PF. So that by the time of 2008, when Zanu PF faced its greatest challenge, the army, the police, the CIO, and the prison services willingly jumped in to help bail out Zanu PF. Zanu PF lost the March 2008 vote by as much as 73% to the opposition. But the Zanu PF vote rigging machinery stepped in quickly before the results were announced, changed the result for the parliamentary seats, and also, but most important of all, for the presidential election. Morgan Tsvangirai's 73% was whittled down to 43%, justifying the runoff. And it was during the runoff that the security, the army, the police, the CIO, and prison services came to their own, because personnel within those departments were behind the Zanu PF militia and the war veterans, who were the foot soldiers in the campaign to intimidate the ordinary citizens. And the army itself carried out the heavy duty stuff of beating up people, adapting them, and even killing them. That's the security organs. And as a result, as post 2008, Mugabe had to reward them again. This time, the rewards were extended to generous mining concessions. And that's when the looting in Marange and Chiazba took place big time. And the main thing that people must have accept then is the reality is the top brass were now committing acts, particularly during that runoff in 2008, acts which were contrary to their positions in the army or the police or the CIO. And they knew it. And therefore, then they knew an opposition coming into power would put themselves, they could end up being asked to explain what had happened. So from that point on, the top brass at least were committed to Zanu PF. But what we must understand is that their commitment was they were generously paid, but they were never in power. They were more the slave and not the master. That is what is important here. So when you hear some people talking of how the army has become powerful, that's when you've got to say this is not true. You know, it's a myth. And I'd like to just play one of the videos that has been circulating in my social group. Somebody making that claim.
Because it differentiates South Africa from Zimbabwe. And let me explain. Zanu PF essentially has been a military organization. It has not been a political organization. Most people mistake Zanu PF for a political party. It's a military organization. How has it worked? It has worked like this. The military wing, the president of the party, would be the commander of the military wing. That is when Zanu PF was a liberation struggle fight, right? Post 1990, when it became a government, that arrangement did not change. So the person who commanded the politics of the party was the same commander who commanded the military part of the party. So that gave power to the individual who sat at the helm, and that happened to be Robert Mugabe. So you knew that if you want to go into politics, if you go into the opposition space, you were actually faced with a military commander at the helm who commanded all the security forces in the political party, but also in the state. And he used that, by the way, to intimidate political opponents.
Well, that is true, but I think it is important that one should understand that is not unique to Zimbabwe. The state president being the commander-in-chief of the army is not unique to Zimbabwe. It's common in many countries, in America and many other countries. The state president is the commander-in-chief of the army. The fact that Mugabe happened to be a corrupt individual who went out of his way to bribe these security officers, the police, the army, and so forth, is to be blamed on Mugabe, not the fact that it was a carry on from the armed struggle days. It wasn't, and I think it is important that that point should be made very clear. And Norway saw is this actually been proven than during the GNU of 2008 to 2013. That was the time when SADC forced Zanu PF to sign the global political agreement, which basically said Zimbabwe must implement democratic reforms to take away the dictatorial powers that Zanu PF was enjoying. And implementation of those reforms would have ended the Zanu PF dictatorship. So this is the party at its weakest. And yet, throughout the GNU years, the army, the police, the CIO played no part at all in stopping the reforms being implemented. If they were the real power behind the Zanu PF throne, why didn't they step in and say, no, we don't want the GNU? Or during the GNU itself, there is no point where one can say the MDC failed to implement these reforms because the army stopped them. The army played no part, none. Morgan Tsvangirai and company failed to implement even one meaningful reform during the GNU because they were corrupt and incompetent. That is the fact. And some people do not want to accept that, so they want to create this narrative that, the army is so powerful that the opposition could not implement reforms because the army would not allow it. That is a myth. We should deal with facts, not myths. The other myth has also come from the G40, people like Professor Jonathan Moyo, who had to escape after the 2017 military coup. And ever since, he has now come back and pretended the army is so powerful. The Zanu PF government that is there now is actually a military. The army was no more powerful now than it was during Mugabe's time. The Joint Operation Command was set up by Mugabe. And yes, during the factional struggle, it divided the armed services. In fact, the army on one side, the police and the CIO on the other. And it so turned out that the army prevailed. And therefore, then those in G40, like Professor Jonathan Moyo, found themselves on the losing side. But it could have well have been the other way around, where the police and the CIO prevailed. And then the Mnangagwa group will be saying, Zimbabwe is a police state. It's the army itself, like I said, has been the slave in this relationship. The real political power is always rested with Mugabe and now with Mnangagwa. The army, yes, some of the people in the army, like Vice President Constantino Chiwenga, have been promoted to vice president. But even there, we can see that he is not wielding any power at all. In fact, according to the rumor, he wanted Mnangagwa to serve only one term and then he would take over. And we know that Mnangagwa has outwitted him and is the candidate, at least the declared candidate of the party right now, and is going to contest the 2023 elections, and thus extending his term of office to a second term. So the army itself is not as powerful as some people want us to believe. They just want the myth to continue to justify their own failings in the case of the opposition, and in the case of the G40 to justify their own failure to prevail during the factional war between the two factions. Like I said, the army, if it was that powerful, the best time we would have seen them flex their muscle was during the GNU, when Zanu PF's hold on power was um, threatened at the most. If the opposition had implemented the democratic reform, we'll be talking of a totally different Zimbabwe right now. And the army did not stop the opposition implementing the reforms. And to suggest otherwise is just a lie. Thank you and good night.